start. I will introduce you. So good afternoon to everybody. It's my great pleasure to invite Professor David Mark Richardson from Stellenbosch University. Without exaggeration, it's one of the most famous ecologists that have ever visited our department. Dave is famous for his studies of invasion ecology, mainly plant invasions, mainly woody plant invasions, but also many other things that are broadly related to invasions, to plant ecology and botany. He's an author of about 500 scientific publications, including several books that he wrote or edited. Many of them are about plant invasions, but he also is an author of a monograph of Pinus, the genus Pinus, Ecology and Biogeography of Pines globally. And he's also a co-author of the book on vegetation of South Africa. He studied at universities of Stellenbosch and Cape Town, one of the most prestigious universities not only in South Africa but in the whole African continent. And he was working at University of Cape Town, and then he was appointed at the University of Stellenbosch, where he became the director of Center of Invasion Ecology. He is also famous as long-term editor-in-chief of the journal Diversity and Distributions, which he developed into one of the globally most prestigious journals in the field of conservation biology and ecology in general. So if some of you published or are going to publish some articles in Diversity and Distributions, then remember that this journal is Dave's child, let's say. Dave is now for 1 year's sabbatical stay in the Czech Republic, in Prague, and he was so kind to accept our invitation and come to give us a presentation, which will be about biological invasions in South Africa. So Dave, the floor is yours.
Many thanks, Milan, and nice to be here again, and nice to see you all. I don't like being introduced as the former editor-in-chief of the journal, especially when people come and say, "Are you the guy that rejected my papers?" But I'm happy to say that the one person that introduced himself that way said I did it in a nice way, which is good to know. So I'm from South Africa, and I'm going to be speaking to you about some insights that of invasions there. So as I'm sure you all know, biological invasions have been studied for hundreds of years. Many of the pioneering naturalists like Charles Darwin wrote really interesting things about invasions. Charles Darwin, in his Voyage of the Beagle and his Origin of Species, wrote really interesting things about those two species of Asteraceae, which might have been the first invasion ecology accounts, really. And in his Origin of Species wrote some really interesting and profound ideas about the whole process of naturalization. It was not until the 1950s, and I'm sure you've all heard of this famous book of Charles Elton. It was not a textbook. It was a popular book that emanated from Elton's series of lectures on the BBC on invasions. And many people, me included, think of this book as the beginning of the scientific study of invasions, and that is not to undermine and to devalue the work that came before this, but Elton made some really profound observations, and he was the first person to really synthesize biological invasions as a global phenomenon. Despite Elton's famous book in 1958, there was not much action in invasion science until the mid-1980s. In the mid-1980s, there was an international program under the auspices of SCOPE. SCOPE is the Scientific Committee of the Problems of the Environment. And this was initiated and resulted in a whole lot of regional syntheses and global syntheses on particular themes, and also an international synthesis. And the SCOPE program had these three questions as its underpinning. What factors determine whether a species will become invasive? What are the characteristics of sites, habitats, and ecosystems that render them susceptible to invasions? And how we can use this information to institute management. And the study of impacts was not really explicit in the three underpinning things that led the SCOPE program. And indeed, this study of impacts has lagged behind some other aspects in invasion science until fairly recently. South Africa is where I'm from, where I was born and raised, and have done most of my research. It's a particularly interesting place to be interested in invasions for a whole lot of reasons. Most importantly, it's a mega diverse country with huge biodiversity in terms of organisms, but also ecosystems. We have everything in South Africa from real deserts through to forests. We have grasslands, we have shrublands, we have savannas, we have thicket biome. We have two major oceans, and we have a warm ocean current on the east coast, and a cold current on the west coast, which produce a particularly rich and interesting biota at the southern tip of Africa. We have a rich freshwater ecosystems with associated with biota and levels of endemism in rivers and other freshwater habitats. We have a rich tapestry of human cultures and histories there, ranging from affluent green suburbs to really poor areas and everything in between, which creates a really interesting system to think about the drivers of introduction and how introduced species are perceived and how they are prioritized for management. We have a large system of protected areas, many of which adjoin onto urban areas. So So we have gradients from natural or the pristine ecosystems to highly transformed ecosystems in many parts of South Africa, for instance, here and around Cape Town. A few of my colleagues and I recently produced this 1,000-page encyclopedia on invasions in South Africa. It was published open access, so if you're interested, have a look and download it. If you think about impacts, there were 30 chapters in this book, but 3 of them dealt specifically with impacts, and those dealt with impacts of invasive species on water resources, rangelands, and the biodiversity. There were, however, many other chapters that had aspects of impacts in them. There have been a few reviews published in the last decade or 2 on impacts, all of which are now out of date. All of them are dealt with the major impacts only of the plant species. And all of them have concluded that impacts have been inadequately studied and that there are large research gaps. So why do we need better and up-to-date estimates of impacts? Firstly, we need to know where to spend money on managing invasions. I'm sure many of you might have heard of the Working for Water program. I think that the largest public works program in the world that focuses exclusively on the management of invasions. It's been well funded by the government for almost 30 years. It's very, very expensive, though, and it's becoming increasingly necessary to provide scientific evidence to justify the really substantial amount of money that is spent on this. Increasingly, there are conflicts of interest around invasions. Mostly, many of the animal invasions, but also a lot of the invasive plants in South Africa are valued by some sectors of society, whereas other sectors of society view them as harmful or needing management. And again, we need this scientific evidence on impacts to inform these arguments. So we undertook a detailed literature survey to have a look at which introduced organisms have been studied for impact. So we looked at all taxonomic groups, and we looked at invasions in natural, semi-natural, and urban areas. We focused on actual impact, so impacts that have been studied scientifically. We did not include anecdotal evidence of impact. It seems as if there was impact. And we also looked at efforts where there have been attempts to upscale the influence of invasions from the plot level up to the landscape and higher up. We found 123 publications that fitted in with our criteria. These focused on 71 species, which is a lot, but it's only 5% of the recorded naturalized alien biota of the country. And only 19 studies have modeled impacts at scales higher than the plot level. So if we have a look at the timeline, almost all studies are after the 1980s. Many of them were stimulated by the SCOPE program. Many more were stimulated by the initiation of the Working for Water program. And I think many others were initiated after the establishment in 2004 of the center that I was involved in, and a national center of excellence looking at all aspects of invasions. A publication on the results of this was produced and appeared last year in the journal Biological Invasions, with lots of supplementary appendices and everything. So most of what I will be speaking about today, if you're interested and want more details, is in this publication. Most of it, but not all. So let's have a look. How do we classify impacts? We first had a look at the impacts on ecological things, and we used the ICAT scheme. I don't know if you've heard about it. ICAT stands for Ecological Impacts Classification of Alien Taxa, publication in 2014, whereby ecological impacts are classified into all of these categories shown here. We were also interested in how invasive species affected socio-economic aspects, and for that we used the SciCat scheme, publication in 2018 on socio-economic impact classification of alien taxa. So we used these two schemes to classify all of the recorded impacts. We found that more than 70% of the published work on impacts in South Africa has focused on the impacts of alien plants, mostly on trees and shrubs. And if any of you have been to South Africa, you will know why that is. It's really extraordinary that so much of South Africa, its diverse habitats and biomes and ecosystems have been really hammered by introduced woody plants. 8% of the work on marine invertebrates and 7% on freshwater fish. Unlike many other parts of the world, not much has been published on impacts of vertebrate invasions, and that's because there haven't been many of those. No studies of the impacts of reptiles or marine fish, again because we haven't had any notable invasions of these groups. So as I said, South Africa is extraordinary. I've called it the world capital of tree invasions, because we have relatively few native forests and relatively few tree species that are suitable for forestry. 200 years ago, there was introductions began, and several hundred tree species have been introduced. many of them have become invasive. So, and invasions in these groups of organisms have been much more recent. Many of the impacts that may still happen and be happening now have not really manifested to a large extent. So there are not many publications on these on these groups. Most of the studies have been in terrestrial ecosystems, which seem to have been by far the most severely impacted by invasions, and far fewer insights have been published on natural freshwater ecosystems and the other categories. Categories of impact, by far the most well documented, have been indirect impacts through interactions. Quite a few on competition. Changes in ecosystem function have been huge, with trees that have transformed shrublands and grasslands, with major impacts on things like water production from watersheds, which we will hear about later. Indirect impacts through species interaction and the alteration of species habitats, disruption of pollination and seed dispersal networks has been well studied. I've just picked out three that I think are particularly interesting examples of this category of impact. So Argentine ants are introduced to many parts of the world. In South Africa, their particular impact is that they displace native ants, which play a huge role in seed dispersal of a wide range of endemic plants, especially in the fynbos biome in the southwest. And Argentine ants displace the native ants that carry out the seed dispersal function, and where they have invaded, there's large-scale recruitment failure. Here's another interesting example. Chromalina odorata, a species of Asteraceae, has invaded large areas of the music savanna, where it's had a interesting impact on the native Nile crocodile. Now, how does it do this? Okay, well, the Chromalina and the Nile crocodile, they inhabit the same sort of ecosystems. The Chromalina forms very, very dense thickets along river courses where the Nile crocodiles nest. And these invasions alter the soil temperature, which alters the sex ratios of the hatchlings. In many reptiles, and I'm not a zoologist, but the sex of the hatchlings is determined to a large extent by the temperature regime of the eggs. So a really interesting impact. Another interesting impact is that of this marine mussel, the Mediterranean mussel. Interestingly, the invasion of this species was only detected after the invasion was quite well advanced. It now occurs along large areas of the South African coast, where it's had both positive and negative impacts. It's had positive impacts on the threatened African black oyster catcher, which has benefited from the abundant new food source. However, some species of crabs have been really negatively impacted. And having a look at the crab impact. So some marine ecologists, before the impact of this mussel on the crab had been well studied, they did a survey among all marine ecologists with expertise of rocky coasts and sandy beaches in South Africa, and asked them what they thought the impact of this mussel would be. And this is the crab in question. It's a mobile, burrowing, predatory crab that occupies the surf zone. A large number of the ecologists that were surveyed said that they could not imagine there being a negative impact. And the impact could only be positive, in that it would provide extra food. In reality, the invasion of this mussel has caused mass mortality of the crabs when the mussels land and fasten themselves onto the carapace of these crabs, leading to mass mortality events. And I raise this just to show how unpredictable many of these impacts are. So we've had impacts have been well documented with competition, and there are just a few examples here of some of the trees and shrubs, aquatic plants. Some snails have had impact that has been attributed to the competition of the introduced organism with native organisms. Impacts on ecosystem function, as I said before, we've had many instances of the transformation of grasslands, shrublands, and many of those two types by introduced trees that completely alter the hydrological regime of these ecosystems, and also cause huge alterations to the fire regime, leading to much more intense fires and much more increased damage to infrastructure. We have had instances of predation where introduced mammals have had impacts, mainly, if not exclusively, on offshore islands. Vertebrate alien species have been noticeably unsuccessful in invading terrestrial habitats on the mainland, and where they do form naturalized populations, I think the biotic resistance of our native fauna has prevented there being substantial impacts. Hybridization, we've had a few well documented records of hybridization. The mallard duck is widely hybridized with the African black duck, with the African yellow-billed duck, sorry. Donkeys and zebra. And we've had instances of hybridization also with freshwater fish and amphibians and trees. Rinderpest was probably the biggest and most impactful invasion in the history of South Africa. Occurred in the 1890s, but it impacted largely alien livestock more than native biota. Unfortunately, and this is a problem for the utilization of the results of research in management. Most of the research on impacts in South Africa has been at the scale of small plots, and have addressed only one species. There have been quite a few, mainly in the last decade, of studies using research results, but to inform models in an attempt to scale up from the small plot scale through to landscape and to provide a means for using this information towards management. There have been quite a few studies that have sought to understand how the impact has changed over time, and this is an example of a prosopis, which is a thorny shrub or tree from the Neotropics and Central America, introduced into the arid areas of South Africa to provide forage for livestock and also shade in these arid areas. It hung around for a few decades before initiating a huge invasion. And in this graph, we see initially, soon after introduction, the net benefits of this tree, and it formed hybrids. So of these trees increased until the stage when the invasive populations began to have a major landscape effect, at which time the net benefit of the taxon began to decrease, until now, where the net impact of this species in the landscape is clearly negative, irrespective of the units that you use. You can use financial units or impacts on biodiversity or impacts on water. It becomes negative. A lot of work has been done, hydrological work that has informed and has sustained funding for the public works program. The Working for Water program has shown how increasing tree cover in form of treeless or tree-poor ecosystems has radically altered the hydrology, leading to decreased water flow, and in a semi-arid region like South Africa, this is really important. So South African examples are often cited in textbooks and review papers as key examples of how bad impacts of invasive species can be. Our understanding of these impacts is still imperfect, it's grown a lot in the last 2.5 decades. We still have only published work on about 5% of the alien biota, and relatively few studies have provided real hard evidence at beyond the plot scale, and it's clear that we have a large invasion debt, and that many new impacts will happen in the future. There's been some interesting work to show how impacts of invasive species interact with other facets of global change. For instance, habitat change, overharvesting, pollution, and climate change. And this is quite an interesting paper. It's in that book that I showed you, where these authors have scored where any of these aspects of global change has been assessed, and where there is evidence for any of the others. And I think this is a really alarming finding around the world, that invasive species are often are catalyzed and form interactions, and it's been called a lethal cocktail of global change drivers. And I think dealing with multiple invasions and multiple global change drivers is what we need to focus much more on in the future. So we have made quite a bit of the progress in South Africa in starting to form protocols for how to deal with conflict-generating species. So those species which have both positive, they have benefits in the landscape, but also cause harm. We've also made progress in trying to use the evidence we have to inform prioritization. So how to spend the limited funds we have to ensure that we get most impact for the expenditure. There's increasing evidence that many invasive species are causing regime shifts, and it's these species that we need to really focus on and manage early. So South Africa is, as far as I know, the only country for which we have a full inventory of all the work that has been done on impacts. So can we say, have all the major types of impact been documented? And I think it's fairly obvious that the answer to that is no. And for a long time, there's been a lot of discussion in South Africa about why our ecosystems have not received any invasions like any of these. And the examples here are the Dutch elm disease, the chestnut blight, and the emerald ash borer. So these are invasions of North America by insects that have caused habitat-altering transformations. Until really recently, it's been the view that African ecosystems have been resilient to this sort of invasion. However, so that leads us to ask: is South Africa immune to such type of invasions? And the answer is no. In 2012, the first symptoms of this invasion emerged. It's a species called the Polyphagus shothole borer, It's an ambrosia beetle that was accidentally introduced from Southeast Asia. The first record was actually about 10 years earlier than this. That was only found after the symptoms that there had been evidence in environmental DNA sampling. So anyway, so this species was first positively identified 10 years ago in the eastern part of South Africa, and has since spread throughout the country. And we did an economic assessment. It's really difficult to do economic assessments of an invasion that is still unfolding. You don't really know how far the invasion is going to be. But we did this invasion, and we drew on evidence from areas in other parts of the world where the species has invaded, namely in California and Israel, and we're able to show that the cost of this invasion, if it proceeds as is likely, because there's no way to manage it, it could lead to massive damage. And unlike many of the other invaders that I've spoken about today, the biggest impact of this species is in urban areas, where the shottle borer attacks many species of trees, street trees, native and alien, avocados. So this is I've called this one an invader from hell, because it really seems as if there's no holding it back. So why had no invasions like this happened before? And I have a few ideas about this. The escalating volume of timber imports and the magnitude of the movement of the timber around South Africa has provided a radically new and increased pathway for such invasions. There's also been a huge increase in the extent of alien tree plantings, and this is Johannesburg, which has been called the largest urban forest in the world. A lot of alien trees. Yeah, we see jacarandas. There are maple trees and ash trees and many others. So these have provided a huge resource for introduced insects. Also, the radical alteration in ornamental horticulture. So how trees and shrubs that are used for ornamental horticulture are mass-produced and sold and moved around has changed a lot. Species like the castor oil, Ricinus communis, is one of the absolute favored hosts, reproductive hosts of this polyphagous shottle borer, and provides it seems stepping stones for its invasive spread. And also, probably the worst of all is that a lot of South Africa relies on wood for the fuel, for heating and cooking, and the unregulated movement of firewood is a superb vector for the transfer of this beetle around. Right, so just to end, a few concluding thoughts. So South Africa has a bewildering diversity of impacts. The inventory of impacts is, I think, very informative. It tells us something about the susceptibility and the possibilities of impacts in our various ecosystems. Research has quantified some of the dimensions of the impact and forms of the basis on which we can base calculations of invasion debt and begin to model how the invasions could pan out in the future. As shown by the last example, despite our inventory, we should expect new types and new species that we must be ready for in the future. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you, Dave, for this very interesting talk based on a lot of research over many years. So now we have time for questions.
Thank you so much for the nice presentation. My question is regarding the introduction pathways of the invasive species. So what is the most common of those pathways?
Okay, the question was, what are the most common pathways for introduction? Obviously, it depends which taxa you're interested in, for the plants, for invertebrates, for marine organisms. But for the plants, for which we have the most information, the most important pathways have been commercial forestry and ornamental horticulture, by far. Were you interested in other taxa, marine, freshwater? For instance, we've got lots of invasions of freshwater fishes. Almost all of them arrived intentionally introduced for angling, for recreational fishing. And there's been a lot of work done on using the knowledge of introduction pathways to reduce or prevent further introductions.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes.
You mentioned about South Africa being a kind of cited as a key example for how bad it can be. And while there's like devastating effects of invasive species in other places, are there any kind of these real like hotspots where there's so many invasive species in other regions?
Yeah, there are some. Well, it again depends on which taxa you interested in. And for plant invasions, there are a few hotspots, like all islands are heavily invaded by the plants. I think the southwestern part of South Africa, the Cape Floristic region, is certainly, I would place right up there as one of the parts of the world that has been particularly hammered by introduced species, not so much in terms of numbers of successful invaders. It's actually quite a small number. But those species that have succeeded have done it in great style and have transformed ecosystems like few other places.
A lot of these invasions are surely connected to international trade. Now, I assume that during apartheid, at least in the last decades of that regime, trade was kind of very reduced because of different blockades and so on. And now it has caught up, presumably a lot, also with Asia, with China coming in a lot. I assume you will get more and more, and you are getting already more and more Asian species now. Is that the case?
Yes, so unfortunately, most of our plant invasions that we have were introduced in the 1800s, long before apartheid and sanctions and everything like this. So so those pathways were governed by other things than modern politics. We are certainly getting more species and problem species, especially insect and plant pathogens that are cropping up now from Asia through imports from Southeast Asia. There is a much better control now on many pathways. For instance, it's virtually impossible now to introduce new plant species legally for use in horticulture or forestry without a very detailed risk assessment process. There are not many. The one species that is very widespread in the region I come from is Theba pisana. That's everywhere. There've actually been quite a few studies, despite its abundance and conspicuousness in the landscape. To the best of my knowledge, there hasn't been much evidence that it's having much impact. Well, the species that have been studied the most is the mallard duck and the African yellow-billed duck. That's been quite well studied, but only very recently. So, I mean, many people argue that this is a trivial impact. So who cares if our African yellow-billed duck has got mallard genes in it? I mean, what's the big deal? Ask something that I think we need to discuss over a drink or two. Yeah. Well, okay, for species like the Mediterranean mussel, there's not much that you can do other than encourage the harvesting, but that's not going to have any impact. Most of the work that has been done has been on the plants. I've done a lot of work in interacting with forestry, the multinational companies who work with pines and eucalypts, and you first need to get them, foresters and conservationists, to see the problem or to see the issue in the same way, and to acknowledge that there is a problem. And I think we we have achieved that now. So the forestry people know that the pine trees, Pinus radiata, for instance, in the areas where I come from, is invasive, and they need to spend some of their money to manage it. And with horticulture, there's been a lot of interaction with the nurseries. So the nurseries have withdrawn many of the species that are clearly invasive. They are no longer sold, although there is still some debate about a few species that are huge, what they call the cash cows. They are hugely profitable to the nursery industry, and there is still some debate that they have asked the scientists to prove that certain species are invasive, and to look for ways that they could be made less invasive. For instance, by selection to reduce seed production or things like that.
When I visited South Africa some 20 years ago, I learned that there were very few remnants of the original forests on the south coast. Like I saw a small remnant at Tsitsikamma National Park, and I wonder if attempts have been made to restore parts of this habitat, and if you have problems with invasive species coming in and disturbing the system even more than the rest.
Well, there's a lot of debate about why the forests in that region occupy such a small area. I think most ecologists argue that the reason is not due to human impacts in the past. So there was never much forest there, or not in the last 10,000 years. And early settlers had this notion in the Fynbos region, in the Cape Florida region, why there are so few trees. They found this very uncomfortable. And there are stories of forest rangers who were sent off on horseback with a bag of pine seeds to spread seeds, just to add more trees to the landscape. And there have been various efforts to increase or to introduce species like some of the Australian acacias to the forests, like Acacia melanoxylon, blackwood, to introduce that to the forest, to make the forest more productive. But that's just led to more invasions and has actually degraded the forest. So a lot of the efforts to enrich or to restore what people saw as degraded habitats have actually done a lot more harm than they've benefited the area, I would say. Yeah, it's an imperfect science, but I think a lot of work is being done to develop improved systems for risk assessment. And unfortunately, a lot of those assessments rely on the invasion history of the genus or the species. So if people want to introduce a pine tree, then people will ask, has the species been introduced in other parts of the world? If so, has it become invasive? And I think the understanding of the determinants of invasiveness is developing fast in some groups. And for other groups, we have not much idea, and there will be some surprises in the future. What is that? Well, I don't think in invasion science there are any good surprises. It's all bad. Unfortunately. Thank you. Well, okay. The people eat the Mediterranean mussel as much as they can, and it's not having any impact. It's just as good as a native one. In fact, the fact that this species was invasive in South Africa was only recognized by accident, because it's really similar to a native species. So it's consumed everywhere and anywhere, and they have campaigns to eat more mussels. It's not having any impact. There's been quite a bit of work done around the world. There's a book on this about eat them or something. Eat them, don't shoot them, eat them, or something like this. And I don't think there's any example from anywhere in the world where an invasive animal has been controlled by eating it out of existence. But if you have any ideas, I'd be very interested to hear about it. Do you mean by using the CRISPR and these sort of things, or? I've read quite a bit about this, but as far as I know, those ideas are still ideas. But I really hope it will happen in the future. I don't have any expertise in that area. Sorry, but it's really exciting development.
Clearly difficult to control invasions
invasions, though you have some protocol now for plants. But is there any way or attempts to define the most likely donor area, like climate similarity or something, and to control or implement more strict control for trade from those areas?
That is certainly being done in marine invasions, where most of the introductions are in a ballast water, and they have developed models that are very sophisticated to show where the highest risk, where the ship is coming from, is at a high risk, where it'll pick up water. But the implementation of that in the harbors is not happening at the moment. I mean, we as scientists can develop these fancy models, but when these massive ships come and they have to unload, that you tell them to unload their ballast water in the deep ocean, before you come into the harbor, they say, but then the ship's will capsize, and it takes a long time, obviously, to transfer your ballast water at sea. There's a lot of work going on in that, but it's a big development that still has to be turned into implementation in practice. Well, I think I did mention that it's an interesting take-home message from the assessment of invasions and impact is that very few vertebrates have invaded terrestrial ecosystems in South Africa. So no mammals. Well, we have rabbits that hop around in a few areas, but nothing like no predators have invaded. And I think that there's been some arguments that because of our very rich predator fauna in South Africa, we've got lions and cheetahs and tigers, not tigers, that's from Asia, leopards, but many other small predators that our ecosystems are resistant to those invasions. Mm.
South African flora is remarkable for the diversity of mistletoes. Have you encountered like them attacking alien tree species? So this is what we can
Yeah.
see here in Czechia. The European mistletoe
I'm trying to think. I know that certainly the major invasive trees in South Africa, acacias and pines and eucalypts, are not. That none of them are hosts to mistletoes much. That's an interesting one. I must think about that some more.
So you mentioned there are some beneficial things of invasive species. So I wonder if there is any case and example among these kind of invasive species in terms of treatment of disease in local species. Let's say, for example, if invasive species bring themselves some
I can't think of any. Many introduced fish in a freshwater system have parasites that I know infect other species besides the. But it's a stretch to think that could be beneficial. I think, again, all the surprises that we get are not good ones. Can you think of an example where such a spillover could be positive?
Well, I mentioned that I know that about fish, like how, for example, you can control the invasive species using some pathogen or strain of some pathogen in local species. But I just wanted to know if there is any example of the cases.
Not that I can think of, sorry. Thank you.
Just regarding her question, I know some examples. It's not an invasive species, but introduction of non-native species to control malaria in some parts of the world. You know, they just go and you're familiar with Gambusia species.
Yeah.
So, for instance, in case of Iran, they introduced that specific species to just reduce the risk of malaria. So in majority part of Iran, it's just eradicated. So there's no malaria case anymore. So to mention that. But I'm not agreeing with that approach. It's not because before coming here, I was working with invasion biology in freshwater, and it's not good. You know, I have seen some nasty things, and it's not very good approach to solving some problems, you know, some other problems with invasive or non-native species generally. It's my point of view.
This is mainly used in case of Wolbachia strains, so because they are working against
Ah.
the one strain and the other strain.
In one of those graphs in which you presented the results from the review of impacts, you showed that there are so many studies from natural terrestrial ecosystems, but very few at the tail of the graph from urban ecosystems. Why are you so neglecting urban ecosystems? Because they are somehow hubs of invasions, at least in
Yeah.
Europe. Yeah? So when new species arrives, then it's often into cities, and then it spreads to open landscape.
There have been quite a few studies of invasions in urban cities or urban areas of South Africa. Almost all of them in the last decade. Until then, there was so much focus on the natural systems. Increasingly now, with the issues like human health, and as you say, there's been quite a bit of work done on trees again. That's on the urban edge. They bring a fire into the city. There's been work done on the mallard duck in urban ecosystems. There's been quite a bit of work done on. I had an interesting paper that we really battled to get it published. One of my PhD students done a study to show that invasion of alien trees increases the crime. Where you have dense, species-rich, invasive stands, it provides cover for various criminal activities. You should read that paper and tell me why we had such a hard time to get it published.
Okay, so is it so that like because we are biologists, we are more interested in natural areas and biodiversity, and so the first studies of impact were done
Definitely.
in natural areas because we are simply more interested in them. And
That's
only
different.
now, the focus shifts into more impacts on economy and human health, and for these like urban setting is maybe better for studying there, right?
I think in general, I know that Europe has a long history of urban ecology. This never happened in South Africa until 20 years ago. The people began to become interested, and in the last 10 years, there's quite a bit of work going on at the moment now, looking at urban ecosystems as ecosystems and humans and social ecological systems. So I think there will be a lot more research in this area, which I'm becoming very interested in that area as well.
Okay, thank you. Maybe some last questions. Yes.
Following the ideas that one species, introduced species, can be beneficial, I mean, in the past it was a common practice, then species was introduced intentionally. So always some attempts to let's introduce a predator, introduce the pathogen to control it, but mostly the predator pathogen just shift to a local fauna, flora, so it's even more harmful. Are those cases dropping down, or just those are these ideas?
And I mean, we all know the cane toad in Australia, the textbook studies like that. Fortunately, I think those days are hopefully over now, and most of the big invasions that we'll get into the future will be accidental introductions, or unfortunately, in many invasions there's a long lag. So in many ecosystems, the species that we already have in the system and have large population sizes may well become the big problems in the future. But I hope no more cane toads, no more foxes to remove rabbits and. So there's increasingly South Africa's got a few offshore islands, including some very important biodiversity hotspots. Like there's an island called Marion Island, which is a sub-Antarctic island. Domestic cats were eradicated there 25 years ago. Starting next year, there's a huge program that will be initiated with international funding to get rid of mice, using the expertise from New Zealand. But it will be the biggest island that they've ever been eradicated on.